Chapter 23. The next morning, Vittoria yawned as she ladled another helping of soup into a bowl, then passed it to the awaiting young man. He mumbled a thank you, head bent low to avoid her gaze, then stumbled away. She ignored the awkward sense of awe that all these young men had toward her after she'd helped snatch them from the streets last night. Then again, she was supposed to be a giver, though she didn't think that title would ever feel natural. Or perhaps they just never expected La Principessa to ladle soup. 30 refugees had joined them last night as they'd roamed Necci, distributing food, blankets, and healing supplies as they could. All 30 refugees were now packed into Mateo's house, filling every available space. Once they'd eaten enough to sate their seemingly endless bellies, Benat and his men would transport them to the quarry far outside Necci, near her family. A restless energy made the house feel cramped, particularly with all the new witches. The desperate former guardians found spots to sit, then stared at the floor as if stunned by all that had happened. Had she looked like that when she first arrived? Were they able to comprehend how their lives had changed? Or did they even try? The jolt of entering a brand new world could be disorienting at best, terrifying at worst. How easily she remembered. She gave them all a kind smile as she refilled cups of water. Zuri brushed by, 2 baskets of fresh pita breads in her hands. All of these guardians ate faster than Vittoria and Zuri could supply food. One of Zuri's daughters, a quiet young woman with a fast smile but little to say, had arrived to help in the kitchen. She disappeared every now and then to return to the farms for more food. 3 burlap bags of grains lined the kitchen floor now, along with a few baskets of apples. Mateo had retired to his room to rest. He'd collapsed on the bed and fallen asleep seconds later. At one of the tables, Benat and his men talked in the background. Vittoria loosely tracked their conversation, relieved to be back safely, but fatigued herself. Romeo's attempts at revenge last night had been harrowing. The guardians had finally retreated for good after midnight, but she and the men had been out until dawn assisting workers who needed help healing, locating lost relatives, or just getting home. "Ideal situation," Joska said, interrupting her thoughts. He was a strong witch, maybe 18, with a thirst to prove himself. When excited, he had eager eyes the color of chocolate. He leaned forward. "We keep doing this, Benat, every night. It will pull the guardians out of their force, losing Hode his men. Then he'll be less likely to attack. It can only work to our advantage." "Or he'll attack more," Benat muttered. "The rebels will think we're in league with them, and they'll only grow bolder," said another. "We need to make our position clear to them at least." A frown marred Joska's expression, and his energy deflated. "The Vincela was empty last night." Benat's brow wrinkled. "What?" Joska nodded solemnly. "Empty. We hid the captain so he'd be out of hearing for the night, but they may not find him for a few days if it remains that empty." Benat's fingers twitched as he shook his head. "Another mass execution." No one said a word until Benat spoke to everyone in the room. "For as long as Romeo commits violence against workers and Mateo has the strength, we will continue this work." His gaze flickered to Vittoria. "La Principessa will always give her witches hope." They'd stopped referring to her as Lady and solely called her La Principessa now. She thought of the dearth of rebels on the streets last night, how furious it made her that workers had paid for the rebels' crimes. Thoughts of the rebels led her back to Esperanza. Every hour that passed without information on the deceased High Priestess left her throat a bit tighter. Did Hode feel the same way? Was he already planning how he'd harm her or her family? Should she just confess it all to Mateo now and gamble on whether he'd stop her from going to the rebels herself? Maybe they could take her family somewhere else, at least? A pot of soup bubbled in a cauldron over the fire. She stirred it with a wooden spoon, lost in thought. Zuri bustled by with a basket filled with apples and an exclamation about hungry men. The apples weren't crisp anymore, but the men devoured them anyway. Finally, the food rush slowed. Benat's men wearily transported the refugees away one at a time. Eventually, the newcomers were all gone, and Benat disappeared to rest. 3 of his men stayed behind on duty. The rest left to sleep. Zuri's daughter transported away with a soft smile and a nod to Vittoria. Only Zuri and Vittoria remained. "Well," Zuri collapsed onto a chair. "I'm exhausted. You must be beyond so after being up all night and helping here. Thank you, though. That would have been a mess without your hands to feed those hungry mouths." She was far beyond exhausted. Still, her mind wouldn't settle. It felt like a school of fish darting here and there. Zuri waved at her. Sleep. I'll clean up. Not that there's anything too clean. They even ate the crumbs. The poor souls. First, can I ask you a question? Of course. It's sort of an odd one, and I would prefer you didn't mention it to Mateo. Zuri's interest deepened. She set down the dishes she'd gathered and faced Vittoria fully. It gave Vittoria a moment to wonder whether she should have asked. The two of them had grown close, but would Zuri confide in Mateo anyway? Zuri gestured for her to continue with a nod. Do you know anything of Mateo's mare, Esperanza? Zuri's eyebrows knitted together. For a moment, she seemed puzzled, as if rooting through her mind. Then she shook her head. No, I remember when she was High Priestess, of course, but he's never really spoken of her. Does Benat? She shrugged. Maybe. If he does, he's never talked about her either. Why do you ask? Vittoria forced a smile. Curiosity, I suppose. Everyone is so secretive about her. Mateo, the newsbooks, Romeo. The average witch on the street doesn't know much, I'd wager. She put a hand on her chest. She's like a ghost. That's what death brings upon us. But Zuri eyed her more carefully. The reality that I may soon be High Priestess hangs over me, Vittoria said quietly. She picked at a loose string on her dress. It makes me think of the others who have gone before me, their stories. They were likely so much more prepared than I feel. I'm not born to this the way they were. Not that Esperanza was either, she thought wryly, but Esperanza had a few years of preparation at least. Zuri pulled her chair back and sat down. Her hand was warm when she put it on top of Vittoria's. You can do this, Mizuna. You are made for great things. Vittoria swallowed. 1,000 thoughts rushed to the surface. Though she'd confessed her anxieties to distract Zuri, every word had been true. Now she swam in deeper waters than she wanted to admit. For weeks, she'd been ignoring the reality that one day, if things went right, she'd have to lead all these witches who tried to worship her or wouldn't even meet her eye. Now that she'd said it out loud, she couldn't take it back, and it had become all too real in her own head. It was as if the ground had fallen out from underneath her, and she was left grasping for purchase. But what if I can't do this great thing? She thought. What if Mateo takes us all the way through the Law of Rights, and somehow I mess this up? There was still so much she didn't know. What would they do with her as La Principessa after Mateo won? What if they prevented a civil war? Then what? Would the workers believe that a giver could live among them? Would they feel betrayed that she really was just a lavanda maid? Zuri pressed a palm to her warm cheek as if she sensed her inner tempest. You are enough, Mizuna. Things tend to happen exactly the way they need to, and in the moment we rise to the occasion. We become the person we need to be. So will you. You always have been. Yes, you're right. Vittoria managed to smile. She gave Zuri a quick hug just to break the intensity of the air, and quietly soaked in the warmth of her maternal touch. It grounded her, giving her just enough strength to push the questions back down where they could simmer out of sight again. Thank you, Zuri. Sometimes I just need to find my courage again. Zuri's curious stare followed her as she slipped into the hallway that led to her room. The air felt cooler here, a welcome kiss on her flushed face. Once in her room, she moved to the doors and peered out at the ocean, her arms folded across her middle. Fatigue slowed her thoughts. Still, she thought of Mateo sleeping, but not resting. Most of his men would transport somewhere else to rest for the day. A skeleton crew of 3 would be sufficient to patrol the grounds here. But could she sneak away from them in her exhausted state, find the rebels herself, ask them the right questions and hope they didn't kill her? Or worse, keep her as a bargaining chip? No, she didn't have the energy for that. Not tonight, anyway. Suddenly, she felt imprisoned here. She didn't want to tell Mateo that she needed to seek out the rebels for some purpose set by his pair, but Mateo wouldn't speak of his mare, and Hode had made it clear at the ball that he wanted her to talk to the rebels. Was it just a way to get her killed? Maybe, but maybe there was more. Benat's men would follow her anywhere to keep her safe, so the question was how to elude them without drawing suspicion. She forced herself out of the spiral of thoughts and let her mind float. It fluttered to her family, to Aniko. Then finally, with a gasp, she settled on a plan. Why hadn't she thought of this before? She exhaled, relieved. This could work. Without knowing exactly what information she sought, she'd go to the rebels and ask her questions. Then she'd satisfy this plaguing curiosity, fulfill Hode's requirement, and, possibly, find information that might help them win. She didn't even have to go into the catacombs. She simply needed to talk to a rebel, one who could be discreet. That left one witch who could help her. Tomorrow, she would find that witch.